Most Americans don't realize it, but the next case of genocide in our time is happening right now. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, in December then. And since then, the war has escalated in its viciousness. Just as it was in Hitler's Europe or Pol Pot's Cambodia, genocide is the case now in the Afghanistan of Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev. This collection of some of the Soviet Union's best armor is mute evidence of the past. From the first years of the war, the Soviets were on the defensive, and the Mujahideen, the Freedom Fighters, gravely hurt and harassed them. But now the Soviets have changed their tactics. They've gone on the offensive with an increased use of air power, with commandos trained to fight in Afghanistan, and more troops. They're taking their fight now not to the Mujahideen, but to the people of Afghanistan. The Soviets are trying to empty Afghanistan. They want this country, but they don't want the Afghans. Unyielding people who worship God do not make good communist subjects. There is only half a country left. By carpet bombing villages, agricultural crops, and irrigation systems, most of the pre-war population of 15 million is now gone. More than 1 million are dead. 5 million are refugees, and another 1 million are displaced inside the country. Against Soviet air power, without anti-aircraft guns, the Afghan people are helpless.
They're coming with the jets and helicopters. There were 4 helicopters and 6 jets. They're coming, and then they bomb the whole morning from the 8 o'clock to 10, 11 o'clock. They bombed the village. They killed many people, also children and women. He says he was afraid.
The intensity of the Soviet offensive has been so great that now people are concerned that in the most heavily contested areas later this year, there may be a famine.
You know, but this situation, I think the number of refugees will increase. And still there are many places where the population are still waiting for the harvest. If there is some food, they will not likely leave. If the food is destroyed, or if the production is not enough, there will be about 1 million more people coming.
For every person who leaves Afghanistan, the Mujahideen lose a supporter, someone to hide them, feed them, and give them information. So now, for the first time, some of the freedom fighters take food into the people from neighboring Pakistan to encourage them to stay inside Afghanistan to help them. The Soviet strategy now is to kill every Afghan and make refugees out of the survivors. Without the people's support, in time, the Mujahideen will be driven out into the open. Then they will become the final target, and the resistance will end. Enter into this desperate situation an American, a volunteer, a doctor named John Preston Darby. He has just arrived from Texas, and he is working in an Afghan refugee camp in Pakistan. But this is only Dr. Darby's OJT, his on-the-job training, for in a few days, under heavy security, he will slip across the border into Afghanistan. Press Darby is one of the first of 100 or more American doctors and nurses who will come here over the next year through a volunteer organization, the International Medical Corps. It marks the first time that humanitarian medical aid has ever been taken inside Afghanistan by Americans to help the Afghans.
You have no blood transfusion?
No. Dr. Darby will travel and work with men who over his next 3 months here will become his lifetime friends. A team of Afghan doctors who are leading a new strategy in the war. If they can help enough people inside, if with continuing medical care they can keep the infrastructure together, the people will stay in Afghanistan and not flee. And the freedom fighters will continue to have the support of the population to help them maintain their resistance. That is what Press Darby is here for. There is a good deal of apprehension as we begin this trip. All day long yesterday along the Pakistani border, we could hear the distant sound of bombardment by Soviet aircraft and artillery as they desperately try to block off this Mujahideen gateway into Afghanistan. Dr. John Preston Darby of San Angelo, Texas, is about to begin the adventure of a lifetime. From a Mujahideen base camp inside Afghanistan, this is Stan Atkinson. The West and the United States are far, far away now. In disguise, the American doctor has been smuggled across the border from Pakistan by the Mujahideen, the Afghan Freedom Fighters. And now Dr. Press Darby will begin his work with a small team of Afghan doctors. And the volunteer from Texas will soon discover how admirable, how compelling these people are. Ask an Afghan what his people are all about, and he will tell you that they are people of nature. The land, the sky, the mountains are what they care most about. Through centuries of hard living, it is only nature that has given the Afghans any beauty in life. Our first day in Afghanistan is the first day of their new year. On the Afghan calendar, it is the beginning of the year 1364. To celebrate, the freedom fighters, fierce and feared by the Soviets, are all carrying yellow wildflowers. In the West, we begin the new year in the dead of winter. But for these people of nature, their new year begins on the first day of spring. The Afghans have it right. And now the American doctor's trip begins in earnest. Overnight, Dr. Darby and we hiked in 11 miles from the Pakistan border with 3 camels bearing the medical supplies and our camera equipment. But now everything is being transferred to pack horses for a much faster and longer trip, deeper inside Afghanistan. We are in a freedom fighters base camp. The place smells of war, of the stuff movies are made of. Every day, hundreds of men pass through here going to fight or coming from it. It is the end of the commute for a small fleet of pickups that truck Afghan partisans across the border hourly from Pakistan. And this is the end of the line. From here on, the Mujahideen travel on foot to any one of more than 100 fronts they fight on inside. The trip from here can be 10 miles or 1,000 miles. Tunnels are dug into the hillside, shelters for the trucks in case of a Soviet air raid. But on the hilltops, a heavy-duty air defense system encourages the Soviets to stay away. Press Darby is sick, very sick. Because he'll be inside the country for weeks at a time, he must now go through the painful period of adapting to the food. He has had an explosive case of diarrhea, so one of his first acts in Afghanistan is having to wash out his clothes. Western stomachs just don't adapt well. Dr. Darby feels very weak, but he knows he'll get through this. The greater challenges are what lie ahead.
I'm not worried about my personal safety as much as I am being able to accomplish what I'd like to accomplish while I'm here.
I've been tremendously impressed primarily with the hardiness of these people. They've been able to tolerate no medical care, or very little medical care, war wounds, loss of limbs, war neurosis, and they still fight on.
But the cost of the fighting is still too great. A wounded freedom fighter arrives in camp. He has been hit in a battle nearby the day before. The ambulance is typical. He's lashed to an upside-down bed frame atop a camel. And he's a lucky man. The doctors are here.
Transportation is generally aboard donkeys or camels, and for many miles of a very rough terrain. So this is very difficult for the patient. Of course, there are no blood or blood products available, which makes treatment of shock in war wounds very difficult. Consequently, the survival rate is very low.
As he travels deeper inside Afghanistan, Dr. Darby will keep a daily diary, a journal of his odyssey. There will be so much to write about, an adventure that will be etched in his memory forever.
Had very little sleep and nauseated after only tea for breakfast. Would have loved some fresh naan, but my stomach was still rumbling. Mounting a very fractious horse.
I hate horses. This is the only thing worse than being interviewed on TV.
In spite of apprehension, so weak I needed the horse ride, up and down precipitous trail with constant artillery gunfire in the background. Walking up a hill, encountered many freedom fighters returning from a battle zone. They were very fierce looking, but many of them carrying yellow flowers in their pockets. One presented me with a bouquet, and I was very impressed by this. Yesterday was the first day of spring and the Afghan New Year. Hope this one will be better for them. They deserve it. They deserve liberty. As one said to me, the only superpower they fear is Allah. What devout, devoted, and courageous people.
When they invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the Soviets seriously underestimated the Afghans. They did not expect the resistance they have gotten from the Mujahideen, the fighting men. And the Soviets misjudged the massive punishment the people of Afghanistan are willing to endure. It's going to be a long war. You can see that now in the refugee camps in Pakistan. The Afghans are going to be here for a while. 2.5 years ago, the camp seemed more temporary. Pakistan and the Afghans thought they might be going home. The Soviets were not doing well. Their efforts to pacify Afghanistan had failed when they confronted the Freedom Fighters. There were hopes that the Soviet Union would reconsider. It did, but not to cut and run. Instead, it went on the offensive.
The Soviets are carrying the war. The Soviets are much closer to the Pakistan frontier. They're much more active patrolling. They've used helicopter-borne strike forces, commando battalions. They are going all out.
The refugee camps are now taking on the look of cities. Things are built of brick, not mud. Self-sufficiency is being developed, and Afghans are even working in the Pakistan economy. Pakistan's hospitality to its neighbor continues, and apparently will, even if more Afghans flee across the border.
They are Muslim and we are Muslim, and this is our duty in Islam, that we should support a person who is homeless and who is in such miserable condition.
That Islamic Brotherhood is so strong, it is now pulling some Afghan refugees away from their new lives in the United States. 32-year-old Zia Allah Kazemi fled Afghanistan in 1978 with his parents, but now he's come back from his home in Denver to use the training he got in the States as an emergency medical technician.
The gratification that I get while being here and helping out with people that I know that they need my help, it far outdoes anything that I could be doing in the States right now.
A person need not be Muslim to want to do something about the suffering in Afghanistan. Last year, the first American doctor to enter the country since the Soviet invasion in 1979 saw firsthand what was needed and decided to do something about it. Dr. Robert Simon, Associate Director of Emergency Medicine at UCLA, went out of curiosity and came back committed. So now, volunteers, American doctors are going into Afghanistan with Dr. Simon's International Medical Corps, here to help the Afghan people, sick and injured, victims of a vicious war. Dr. Press Darby is one of them, now looking at a map with his Afghan counterparts to see where he has been and where he is going. For the Americans are strangers in a strange and dangerous land.
The danger for the Afghan people are the gunships, you know.
If you could take care of the gunships, you could take care of the Russians.
If we shoot some of them, you know, with the rocket launcher, with the RPG-7,
Sure.
RPG-3s.
Now they're armored on the bottom, are they?
If they're coming just down, you know, some people they're climbing the trees, you know, and they are waiting really with their RPG-7s, you know, and then when they're coming. I have seen one of them, you know.
They got some.
Yeah. They can come with 10 or 15, some of them there in the sky, and then they can land there, you know.
And bring troops.
And bring troops. This is something, you know, that the Afghan people, they are scared.
And they can hang in the air and wait for
also, they can stay everything, you know. They can do many things.
Our destination is still a day away. On the trail, Dr. Darby passes what was a camel caravan, more recently a target of opportunity for Soviet jets. Air raids on camels break the freedom fighter supply chain and break down the people's economy. But the Afghans don't quit. For the 200 miles Press Darby will travel, there is a constant flow on the trail of mujahideen and trade. The trail is like an expressway of resistance and defiance.
Had not written in the journal for 2 days, so while awaiting departure, caught up on this. I keep looking at pictures of Pam and Hayne, missing them more with each passing day, and hope they are well. I'm far into Afghanistan now, hungry and missing loved ones, okay otherwise. We should leave here in a few hours for our final destination.
Tonight, Dr. Darby, the American volunteer, completes his last leg of his journey inside Afghanistan, and fittingly, the final miles are done in a captured Soviet Army truck. There are a lot of those around, although seriously hurt now by their enemy's new air offenses. The Mujahideen still in combat on the ground are a much better fighting force than the Soviets. The Afghan Freedom Fighters are not your usual disciplined elite army. On the contrary, their military style is built around a participatory democracy. Decisions are made by the group, not just the commander, usually after long and lively discussions. The commander, in fact, rules by acclamation. If he doesn't share power, he gets replaced. But the increasing pressure of the war over the past couple of years has made this people's army get more like the military. Now in Pakistan, there are training camps and the first signs of a more regimented fighting force.
Zindabad Islam! Zindabad!
These are both men who are going into battle for the first time and veterans who've been there before, like this freedom fighter, 10 years old. He tells us he's from Logar province in Afghanistan and that he works for the Mujahideen as a courier. Then he field strips and reassembles a Chinese-made SMG automatic rifle like a drill sergeant. This is a camp of the Afghan National Liberation Force, one of a half-dozen resistance groups. What they have to train with here is the ideal, not the reality. The freedom fighters do not have what they need to protect themselves. The Afghans say their anti-aircraft defenses simply are not sufficient. These 50 caliber machine guns are the common weapon, but not enough firepower to bring down a Soviet gunship or jet, unless Allah steps in with a providential stroke of luck. But the Mujahideen are remarkably resourceful people. A young veteran, knowing his comrades usually won't have the mines or grenades they're being taught how to use, interrupts the class to offer a do-it-yourself alternative.
We just put the wax type of gunpowder inside the tube or any sort of container that we have available, and then we put a piece of burning wire in between the gunpowder inside the pipe, and we just ignite the wire so that it starts burning, and we throw the grenade that we have made onto the enemy. But the only thing we have to be very careful of is that we should measure the length of the wire properly so that it doesn't give the enemy enough time to throw back the grenade at our own selves.
Over the last year, the Soviets have intensified the war in Afghanistan, taking the fight to the resistance more than ever before. They're particularly concentrating on the border area of Pakistan, trying to prevent the Mujahideen from bringing men and materiel through the access areas from Pakistan inside Afghanistan. As a consequence, there's been a lot of fighting along the border. And as a consequence, the hospitals in Pakistan now are busier than ever before. To be wounded in Afghanistan is to die in Afghanistan. Only the strongest or the luckiest make it to hospitals in Pakistan because of the great distances to travel on foot or by animal. The boy will live, but because it took weeks to get him here, his leg will be crippled forever. So 4 years ago, French doctors, volunteers, started going into Afghanistan to ease the death rate. A doctor described how, wherever he went, the Soviets had bombed mosques and schools just ahead of his visits.
Every day in a different village with 2 mules and 4 bags. 1 bag for research, biology, 1 bag surgery, and 2 bags medicine.
You had to keep moving.
Exactly.
This year, American volunteers, doctors and nurses of the International Medical Corps, are also going inside Afghanistan. Dr. Press Darby of San Angelo, Texas, has been traveling for 5 days to get this far, and now he's on the last leg of a journey, 100 miles inside, headed for a beautiful but needy little village in the mountains called Palangay. When a baby is born, or there's a wedding, or when a special guest comes to visit, Afghan tradition calls for a salute of gunfire, an expression of happiness. The American doctor has arrived, and the people of Palangay are happy, very happy. In modern warfare, men and materiel get moved around with relative ease by air and ground transportation, but not so for the freedom fighters of Afghanistan. Their enemy, the Soviets, have that advantage, but the Mujahideen have only their feet and their animals. Against a superpower, logistics in Afghanistan are a nightmare. The last time we saw the medicine, it was headed in the right direction, but that was 3 days ago. The decision had been made then to transfer the medical supplies from pack horses to camels. It took too many horses to carry 1,500 pounds of medicine. That made our caravan too big, too obvious, and too much of a target. A couple of camels could carry it all, more slowly, but we'd split up and go separate ways. Now, 3 days later, we've arrived at our destination. The people of Palangay are thrilled. The American doctor is here, and all that stuff he has with him must be the medicine. No, it's camera equipment, TV gear for the U.S. news crew. Makes nice pictures, but doesn't make people well. No camels, no medicine. Everyone is disappointed. The residents of Palangay, 80,000 people living all around here, and us. Something has gone wrong, so it's time for a jirga, the Afghan form of discussion and decision-making. The freedom fighters and the Afghan doctors talk for a long time, because Afghans love to talk, and especially for a long time. The jirga reaches the obvious conclusion. Somebody's going to have to go back and find out what has gone wrong. So Dr. Darby now has time to catch up on his journal, to write of a place that seems far removed from the war.
Came up a stream bed past green terraced hills, grape arbors, apricot trees in bloom, and the beautiful sound of running water. Stood looking over the valley, watching horsemen going along the stream and donkey trail on the hillside. Listening to roosters crowing, donkeys, and the pleasant sound of the stream. How peaceful. And an illusion destroyed by the Russian jets soon passing overhead.
The beauty of Palangay is deceiving. Like every other town and village in this tortured nation, it has become a place of death. Since the Soviet invasion in 1979, 10,000 people have been killed here. Their bodies are buried facing east in Mecca as a final expression of the faith that caused them to take up arms against their godless invader, the Soviet Union.
These people, they were always happy, and they had just one thing, that their honor should not be touched. And because of this, in the last 5-6 years, we have always success against the Russians. The Russians, they never can win. They can empty Afghanistan. They can kill 1 million or 10 million people from Afghanistan, but they never can get Afghanistan, and we will be always Afghan people.
I'm in the packed room drinking delicious green tea and eating sweet candy. I was finally able to eat some rice tonight after 3 days on nothing but beef jerky and tea. Feel excellent and hope to get a good night's sleep after lots of restless ones in the past. This is a beautiful place. I wish we could stay here longer, but we must leave in the morning to start the long trip home.
We will not leave the next morning. The medicine still hasn't arrived. Everybody's getting edgy. In Afghanistan, it is dangerous for a visitor to stay in one place for more than a day. The freedom fighters of Palangay try to relieve the tension by giving Dr. Darby a guided tour. Proudly, they show off the one anti-aircraft weapon they have for the whole area, a .50 caliber machine gun. Only with a lucky shot is it any defense against the Soviet Air Force. And then from way down the stream bed, we hear the clanking of another overworked, captured Soviet Army truck. The medicine is coming. Nasir has hiked back 30 miles to find the camels. One of them injured a leg. In Afghanistan, time is of no consequence. The camel drivers were just going to wait until the camel could walk again. And then there was another delay.
How are you?
We were lost.
Can you tell him that we're going to have some medicine coming up the hill in just a minute? We'll give it to him, and this will help his stomach.
The clinic finally is open for business. Even before all the medicine has been lugged up the hill from the truck below, the patients start coming. Dr. Darby is working with an Afghan surgeon, Dr. Kudrat Nazrati. He is his medical counterpart and translator. For a kid, though, some words are universal.
Are you ticklish?
Tuberculosis, measles, malnutrition, whooping cough, diphtheria. A doctor here watches the whole array of third world maladies troop by. But in Afghanistan, they are all seriously aggravated by war. Dr. Nazrati has watched his countrymen suffer and die from them for the past 6 years.
In medical area, it's very necessary to send these people monthly medicines sufficient for them to be sufficient for these people. I think in this because I'm a doctor and I just know about their problem that they really needs medical care. I am very hopeful about the future. I thank you. I appreciate my brothers, Americans.
Has he been in battle?
Yeah.
Palangay will not be alone now. When the doctors leave, Arif, an Afghan nurse, will stay behind.
I think with just minimum basic medical care, sanitation, that these people would thrive if just a little bit more could be done. I think we have the medicines, they're getting the trained personnel. I just think we need more of what we already have and more teaching to these people because they're so proud. I think they'd much prefer to take care of themselves.
In Afghanistan, Press Darby will touch thousands of lives with his healing and his caring. For the Afghans, just having the American there is the best medicine. And for him, the feelings are the same.
These are the most incredible people I've ever known. It's an incredible country. I just can't say enough about it. It's the experience of my lifetime to be here. If I didn't have a wife and family, I would stay here forever.
Dr. Press Darby and Dr. Robert Simon of UCLA, the founder of the International Medical Corps, the volunteer group sending American doctors and nurses inside Afghanistan, will both be in Sacramento next month for a public reception. It'll be taking place at the Sacramento Inn, in the Comstock Room, Thursday night, the 6th of June, starting at 6:30 p.m. Tickets are $10 per person and available at the door. For information, you can phone 448-4277. Come join us, the American medical volunteers, and more important, the people of Afghanistan will appreciate that greatly.
Elizabeth Clare Prophet, noted author, lecturer, and educator, interviews the special people who provide the missing dimension to the news that affects you. Courageous men and women from all over the world who have taken a stand for truth and justice and become spokesmen for the flame of freedom. Listen now as Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guests discuss critical issues of the day. This week, Mrs. Prophet talks to Karen McKay, Executive Director of the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, on the Holocaust in Afghanistan.
Welcome to Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks. Today our guest is Karen McKay, Executive Director of the Committee for a Free Afghanistan. Karen McKay is a major in the United States Army Reserve, whose career has been nothing short of extraordinary. She is an expert equestrian, has flown helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, has spent terrifying moments leaping out of airplanes. She holds a bachelor's degree in animal husbandry from Fresno State College. In 1967, she joined the Army, was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and rose to the rank of captain. While in the reserve, she has had assignments with the elite 82nd Airborne Division, the Special Forces, the Pentagon, and the Rapid Deployment Force. After leaving active duty, she spent 4 years in Greece and 5 years in Israel, where she gained first-hand knowledge of Middle Eastern affairs, while pursuing a doctorate in history at Hebrew University and working as a freelance journalist. Karen returned to the United States at the end of 1979, worked as a reporter for the Army Times and later as an assistant to the respected expert on Middle Eastern affairs, Dr. Joseph Cherba. In 1980, she became a reporter for Accuracy in Media, the media watchdog group. In January 1981, a year after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, she organized the Committee for a Free Afghanistan and became its executive director. In an era of relative media and government silence on the Holocaust in Afghanistan, the committee has been one of the few voices keeping the Afghans' heroic struggle for freedom before the public. While serving as the committee's executive director, Karen has testified on Afghanistan and chemical warfare before both houses of Congress, addressed such world bodies as the European Parliament and the Socialist International, participated in a number of international conferences on Afghanistan, foreign policy and defense policy, and written numerous articles on these subjects. She has labored tirelessly for the freedom of the people of Afghanistan. Karen McKay, welcome to Summit University Forum.
Thank you. It's a privilege and honor.
You are the flame of freedom that is speaking today for millions of Afghans. We want to hear about exactly what is happening today. We realize that here is a people of strength and inner spirit and fire, whose nation is being assaulted by a superpower, and most of the world is either unconscious of this or uncaring. The beginning was way back in the 1950s with the building of roads, the moving in of the Soviets, and then came the putting in of their puppets. We see the tragedy happening again and again, that while there is time and while there is opportunity for the reinforcement on the powers of the West, they do not take a stand, they do not move. Today, therefore, when it is at this level, what can we do, we the people, for the people of Afghanistan?
Well, there's a great deal that we can do if we move before it's too late. And after 6 years, for the first time, I think it's fast becoming too late, because half the population of Afghanistan now is either dead or fled the country as refugees. And when you think of something like that happening to America, the numbers are astronomical. The country only had a population of 15 million to start with. More than 5 million have fled as refugees. Another 2 to 3 million have probably been killed in the bombings or of war-related causes. And that doesn't leave very many people inside Afghanistan, and most of them have been terribly affected because there's a famine throughout Afghanistan. There's a medical crisis, a deliberately engineered medical crisis throughout the country. The Soviets long ago developed famine as a weapon against peoples. They used it against the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, what they called the Basmachi, the Turkmen and Azerbaijanis and others of the Asiatic republics, what are today the Asiatic republics. Famine, deportation, and medical crisis are very much weapons in the Soviet arsenal. Other folks rely on bombs and bullets and rockets and so forth. They have developed a far greater arsenal that no nation which has a conscience imposed on it by man or God or public opinion could ever do. But you know, a lot of people ask us, why Afghanistan's important. You've said it more eloquently and much more quickly than I could ever do it already in opening this program. But everywhere I go in America, people ask me, why Afghanistan? There's a tendency on the part of our more arrogant intellectuals in this country to denigrate the Afghans as a bunch of medieval ragheads, worshipping a funny god, talking a funny language, and running around a pile of rocks. And that this has absolutely nothing to do with the West. And my response is usually to remind people of Neville Chamberlain in 1939, who came back to Munich waving his black umbrella and his white paper and saying, "Peace is at hand." When Chamberlain was brought to task by the European Parliament, the British Parliament, about British guarantees to Czechoslovakia, he said, "What is Czechoslovakia? People of whom we know so little and who are so far away." And besides, he shrugged, "There is no more Czechoslovakia, it's all academic." Well, Afghanistan is today's Czechoslovakia. The Soviet invasion of that country was the most blatant and naked act of aggression by one country against a sovereign nation since Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. And Afghanistan has everything to do with the security of the free world, indeed with the future of the Western civilization, the free civilization as we know it. Because from their bases in southern Afghanistan, this map is a perfect example. You see this little nation up here, kind of like a football with a handle. From their bases here in southern Afghanistan, Soviet MiG fighter bombers are only 350 air miles from the Straits of Hormuz, that vital, narrow bottleneck of water through which moves 70% of the oil the free world uses. And then, of course, throughout the Persian Gulf here, you have all the vast oil reserves, the greatest oil reserves in the world. So it was very much a strategic move, kind of a last move in a global chess game that's put us in check to the Russian bear. All over the world, the Soviets have been moving for the past generation to poise themselves to sever our resource lifelines. They have held us mesmerized with nuclear terror, with nuclear blackmail, while moving all over the globe to where they are now positioned anywhere you look, in the Caribbean, in the Horn of Africa, in Southern Africa, in Southeast Asia, Southwest Asia, the Middle East. So wherever there's a hot spot, there is some either choke point in our resource lifeline or a vital source of our raw materials. This country, the United States, is no longer self-sufficient in anything. We can't make a toaster oven, a jet engine, or grow an ear of corn without vital imported resources. And the Soviets have been moving to threaten all of those. And if they move to sever our resource lifelines, we will be forced to capitulate. We can't run a war machine without those imported resources. We import well over 90% of the raw materials we need for our security. The Soviets, by contrast, have over 90% of their raw materials within their borders. And if they are able to consolidate their hold in Afghanistan and these other areas of the world, all they have to do is shut off the tap. And Europe and America and the United States and Japan will be isolated in the ever-widening margins of the Soviet Empire, isolated one from the other to atrophy and drop off. And if we want to continue to survive, we're going to have to do it on their terms, because we don't have the airlift, the sea lift, or the strategic mineral reserve to run a war. And that's why Afghanistan's important to us. And what we've got to do about it is support the Afghan Freedom Fighters before there's no more hope left. Because as a member of the Rapid Deployment Force, up until a few months ago, I'm now in another kind of reserve unit, it's no secret to anyone that we don't have the airlift or the sea lift capability to insert or project our force anywhere in the world. And the RDF is nothing but a tripwire. We're a reallocation of insufficient resources. And say if we were to go somewhere here in the Persian Gulf, which is what Jimmy Carter designed the RDF to do, they're not going to be able to resupply us, or reinforce us, or pull us out when the going gets tough. For 3 years, I've had my duffel bag behind my piano, and my mother in San Diego on alert to come and take care of the kids if I get mobilized, if the RDF moves out, because I was on 24-hour notice. And we knew, those of us in these units, it's one-way ticket, we're not coming back. And the Afghan Freedom Fighters are our rapid deployment force. They are deployed, they are fighting, they are the only people in the world who are fighting and killing Soviet soldiers today in the name of freedom. And for this reason alone, the strategic imperative, we need to support these people, never mind the moral imperative, which is equally strong.
Well, here you have, as you've pointed out, a potential domino effect. We all know how long the Soviet Union has spent infiltrating and setting itself up in India, for instance. We know how corrupt and drug-ridden Pakistan is, and how they even have betrayed the Afghans with their short-sightedness. So here's the domino effect going right through Southeast Asia, which ought to concern China as well. Is China taking any steps to aid the Afghans?
Yes, China is probably doing more than anyone for
the Afghans.
For the Afghans, but you know, during the Vietnam War, a lot of our intellectuals and journalists and so forth laughed at the domino theory. It worked. Vietnam fell, Laos and Cambodia fell, Thailand is threatened today. And you're right, the domino theory can work here too, but it can work the other way too. If we support the Afghan freedom fighters today, it could be the opposite of the domino theory. It could be the spark that ignites a string of firecrackers. The entire captive world is watching Afghanistan. Lech Walesa, the Solidarity movement in Poland, has said over and over that what gives them courage to have hung in there as long as they did were the Afghan freedom fighters. And our liberal intellectuals here, and our media people, like Dan Rather, tend to sneer at the Afghans as being so dumb, so medieval, that they don't know any better than to fight the Russians. They're not smart enough to know that you have to capitulate and live with the Russians. And in this, the Afghans are providing an example to all of us, a beacon of liberty, a beacon of freedom, a shining example of what you can do, that the Soviet Empire is neither immutable nor inevitable, and that Ivan is not 10 feet tall, undefeatable, or immortal, that you can fight Ivan, and you can win. But I'd like to take exception to one thing, and that's about Pakistan. Without Pakistan, the Afghan freedom fighters could not have held out as long as they have.
True.
Pakistan has been extremely generous. They have taken in over 4 million refugees in a country whose economy was already weak before all this started. A country whose society and very fabric is weak, and rent with divisions primarily because of Soviet activity. Since Pakistan was established in 1948, the Soviets have been trying to carve it up. The Soviets have been sponsoring a potential war of national liberation here in the ancient kingdom of Baluchistan, which comprises the southern third of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. And part of the long-term Soviet game plan is to dismember Pakistan. And Pakistan will be no more. There is no historical precedent for the country. And it would be a relatively easy thing, given the way the world works, to dismember Pakistan and disappear it forever. Corruption there is no worse than corruption anywhere in the third world, or perhaps in the Western world as well, or the Soviet world. I have a lot of admiration for the Paks. They've got a splendid army. Their foreign service, their civil service, their military officers are the creme de la creme. You find the finest people. Oxford graduates, Cambridge graduates, people who have read Keats and Shelley in their civil service. Try and find one like that in our bureaucracy, the State Department.
That's terrific.
I have a lot of admiration for the Paks. And as for drugs, they are fighting a last-ditch war against the drugs. Drugs are a problem there, but not because of the Paks. What happened was that the French connection was busted up about the same time the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And under the cover of the confusion and turmoil there, what was left of the drug empire moved into the NWFP, the Northwest Frontier Area, which is a no man's land for thousands of years, controlled only by the tribes and by no kingdom or no president or no other power, and have set up in there. And the tribal leaders who work with the Paks to maintain security in that area are fighting these people. I was a guest of the chief of the Afridis one day. He killed a sheep for me when two suspected drug runners or drug dealers were brought in. And they were going to be handed over the next day to the Paks, what was left of them. I decided not to stay around to see what happens to suspected drug dealers in the tribal territories.
Well, tell me then what we hear about U.S. aid getting short-stopped in Pakistan and not reaching the Afghans.
Disinformation.
Well, then what is happening to U.S. aid? Is it getting there, or isn't it being delivered? What about the $280 million that was appropriated?
It's a figment of somebody's imagination. Now, what we have here is almost an unholy alliance of the CIA and the KGB pulling the wool over the American people's eyes. The CIA, because the State Department wants us to get off their back. They want the American people to believe that everything necessary, in their words, is being done for the Afghans. And they will point to the number of aircraft that have been allegedly shot down in the last year, and they will say dozens of Soviet aircraft have been shot down. Some have been shot down, but very few, because the Afghans lack anti-aircraft weapons. Most of the Soviet air losses are due to pilot error or equipment failures, because that's a tough terrain to operate helicopters or MiGs or Sukhoi aircraft in. But the State Department is now claiming that all these are being shot down because we're doing everything necessary for the Afghans. They'd like us to get off their backs. They don't intend that any traceable, visible, or effective American aid or foreign aid of any sort get into the Afghan people. And so they are running kind of a disinformation campaign in the media and on the Hill and anywhere else. We have debated State Department officials in Amnesty International meetings and so forth, where they claim there's no hunger, there's no medical problem, the Afghans have more guns than they know what to do with them, they got more pills than they know what to do with them. In any case, they're incompetent. In any case, the Russians really aren't there. And you know, really radical and extreme statements, which are easily refutable, except that people want to believe their government and tend to believe their government. Now, the KGB wants us to believe that America's behind the freedom fighters because that justifies their presence in Afghanistan. They have claimed from the beginning that they only had to go there with limited contingents to help the friendly government because of CIA-sponsored rebels, bandits, and terrorists threatening the revolution in Afghanistan. And they still, to this day, 6 years later, tell every Russian soldier who goes to Afghanistan and is sent there on duty that America has occupied the country. They're going there to liberate Afghanistan from the American imperialists, the Chinese hegemonists, and the Israeli Zionists. You know, it's, all those terms always go together. There's no such thing as an American or a Chinese. It's always a Chinese hegemonist or an Israeli Zionist or an American imperialist in the Soviet lexicon. But on the ground in Afghanistan, the bottom line is that when you're in Afghanistan, there is no evidence of any effective outside aid, any significant aid. Obviously, there is some. One cannot deny that. There is some American aid, there is some Chinese aid. There used to be Egyptian aid before Sadat was murdered. But there is no evidence of any effective or significant aid from any source. Nothing that by virtue of its quality or quantity you could even speculate as being from American sources, even through a third nation. And that's the bottom line. Now, the problem with all these reports in the media, all this speculation of $280 million, $350 million, $680 million worth of aid having gone to the Afghans over the last few years, is that this comes out over reports inside Afghanistan. They hear it on VOA, they hear it on BBC, they pick it up from other international broadcasts, or they hear it in Peshawar. And then they, in turn, the guy in the field, you know, Joe Mohammed, freedom fighter, accuses his Peshawar leadership of having ripped off and sold these weapons for personal profit. The Peshawar leadership, you know, Peshawar is up here on the Pakistan border. It's the gateway to the Khyber Pass and into Afghanistan. They, in turn, suspect that the PAC's been doing this because surely the international media wouldn't lie. And it must surely, therefore, exist, so where is it? So they, in turn, suspect the PACs of having ripped it off and not given it to them. And the poor PACs say, you know, my God, there is, you know, where is it?
We've never seen it.
If you were President Zia with a Soviet army of about 250,000 combat and combat support troops on your border, threatening your country, would you not rather fight for your country with Afghan blood than with your own? It would not be in the interest of Pakistan to stop aid from going into Afghanistan. It would be cutting their own throat, because they're between a rock and a hard place. They have India under Soviet sponsorship making trouble on their eastern border. They've got Iran over here on their western border. And on their north, they've got the Red Army. And they have a very unfaithful ally in the United States. We have shown ourselves to be a very faithless supporter of any country in the world or any movement in the world.
That's true.
And President Zia has got to ask himself, now if I go any further than I have in standing up to the Russians, where's Uncle Sam going to be when the going gets tough? Can I really count on him to help me pull my irons out of the fire when the Soviets come over the border? Because, you know, the last administration, Carter's administration, pulled the rug out from under the PACs, stopped all military and economic aid to the PACs over this Islamic bomb issue. Well, all that did was render these people totally vulnerable to aggression from India or from Soviet Union or from anywhere else. And now we have a fairly modest weapons aid or military aid program going with Pakistan for the last 5 years, but the pipeline is just filtering the stuff in. The Pakistanis are still totally vulnerable, totally naked to a Soviet thrust across the border. And there have been thousands of Soviet border violations of Pakistan's territorial integrity in the last 5-6 years. More in the last 3 months than the past 6 years combined, as Gorbachev steps up the pressure on Zia. And you recall reading in the media that Gorbachev blatantly, nakedly threatened Zia that if he didn't stop giving aid and protection to the Afghan freedom fighters, the Russians were going to come down on him hard. That's right. And it was you know, no velvet gloves, no mask, no nothing. You know, the pussyfooting game of Brezhnev and Andropov et al. Was gone. Chernenko, Gorbachev doesn't fool around. He's a young man, and he's going to act in a very vigorous manner. And it was a very blatant, rude, in political terms, threat to Zia. So the Pakistanis have been taking some awful chances in supporting the Afghans. And they're doing it not only in their own interests, and not only because the Afghans are brother Muslims, but they're doing it because the Pakistanis are basically a conservative, anti-communist, God-fearing people. And they don't want the Russians in their country.
We're very glad to have this cleared up because we have fallen prey to the same media that everyone has.
Absolutely. It's been a very skillful campaign of disinformation. And I think the bottom, you know, anybody who claims that he knows the figures of so-called American aid, alleged CIA aid, anybody who uses a hard figure is lying. Because anyone who's in a position to know how much aid may or may not have been allocated or have gone to Afghanistan isn't talking. There have been no official pronouncements. All of these reports of X amount of aid have been speculation, rumors, deliberate leaks and disinformation. But nobody who really is in a position to know has ever said anything about it. I think that maybe that buried in the various budgets that some aid has been earmarked, but has never been really sent, except, you know, little bits and pieces of things that I do know about. I see some of the stuff over there. Thompson submachine guns that they stopped making before World War II. 303 ammunition that's marked on the box, do not use after July 17th, 1944.
They're just dumping their waste.
Ash and trash, yeah.
Karen, we are American citizens. We do not have to be astute political scientists to recognize the situation. We have been observing the Soviet Union since we were children. Now, it's very obvious what kind of a key Afghanistan is. We do not need to teach our representatives in Congress or at the CIA or the FBI or the State Department. They know.
They should know.
Therefore, what is the real power play behind the denial of aid? What is the conspiracy and the cooperation between the capitalists of the West and the communists that has given them technology or closed their eyes and let it happen? It's been going on throughout this century. The American people need to know why. Why are our leaders refusing aid to our brothers and sisters?
Boy, that's a hard one, Mrs. Prophet. There's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of conspiracy theories going around. For a long time I refused to accept anyone because I, as a patriotic American, did not want to believe that my country would be so malevolent. But then when you get to thinking about it, you know, we built the Karma River Truck Factory. Those are Ford trucks run by, and the factory is operated by IBM, supposedly for agricultural use only, and those are what haul the Soviet troops into Afghanistan. The initial invasion force is still today. In fact, we built their entire industrial infrastructure because the Soviets are neither builders nor repairers. This goes back again to the threat to our resource lifelines. These people can't make anything, not even a sewing machine. They've got to capture what other people have. They don't want to blow us to smithereens with nukes. They want what we've got intact. So when Lenin said that the capitalists would sell them the rope to hang us with, he was quite right. We are doing that very vigorously and giving them credits too for buying our rope. Not only that, but we're selling them shovels on credit to dig our graves with. But as for where all of this come from, the conspiracy theory, you can't help but give it some credence. But I think when it comes down to the State Department, it may be more a matter of these entrenched bureaucrats not wanting, you know, the old thing of don't rock the boat, don't do anything radical. You can't make any mistakes if you don't do anything. Preservation of the status quo. The State Department is very much a preservation of the status quo thing, even if the status quo changes every day at Soviet whim. They're going to stick with whatever the Soviets come up with next. And they'll fight to the death for the Soviets to have the right to extend their sphere of influence. Our problem with aiding the Afghans is definitely in the State Department. And the CIA is very much the instrument of the State Department in this case, I believe. I believe that the White House is beginning to realize that their own State Department and the CIA have been lying to them all these years. I believe that Congress is coming to that realization. I think the same kind of people, the same kind of mentality is still in place in our bureaucracy that condemned the Jews of Europe to the Holocaust. You remember that fated ship that sailed up and down the shores of Northern America in 1939 with over 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children on it, seeking haven. They went to Cuba, and they went to Florida, and they came to Washington, and all up and down, and nowhere were they allowed to disembark. And finally they sailed back to Europe. And of that ship of people, one human being survived the death camps. They all went to Auschwitz. And the people who condemned the Jews, who slammed the doors of America and urged other nations to do likewise, and bottled the Jews up in Europe, and disapproved any plan to bomb Auschwitz and the rail lines from Hungary leading to Auschwitz, we could have saved millions of people's lives. We had the military capability to do it. We were pinpoint bombing Auschwitz in 1944 and late 43. We were bombing patterns around the rail lines, bombing patterns around the ovens. And we were hitting every rail bridge and every train except those carrying Jews. We were hitting everything at Auschwitz and other death camps except the crematoria and the gas chambers. The same people who were responsible for the Holocaust in America are responsible for the Holocaust in Afghanistan. And it is a Holocaust. It's an overused word. There was one presidential candidate in the last election who referred to the lack of black rights in America as being genocide and a Holocaust. You know, those are very much overworked words. But the Holocaust in Afghanistan will stand in the annals of infamy and history next to the Jewish Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, and the Cambodian Holocaust, because that's very much what it was. And the blame can be laid at the door of the State Department as much as it can be at the door of the Kremlin. Just as Hitler was not solely responsible for the Nazi Holocaust, the State Department aided him in completing it and fulfilling it for very complex, extended reasons that we won't go into here. These are some of the reasons why we're not helping the Afghans.
What you're really saying is that if the American people want to retain their freedom and their integrity as a nation, they're going to have to get to the core of those who are the unelected officials that are running this country, the bureaucrats. They're going to have to demand that the president keep his word as to his campaign promises, and those in Congress and in the Senate. And people are going to have to get alive and realize that their future is in total jeopardy because of Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We know that President Reagan is totally committed to the freedom fighters. I've met with him myself. I took 6 freedom fighters to see him some time back. These were people who were survivors of a horrible massacre in Logman. And he has repeatedly said that if the Afghans need weapons, we'll give them. We're never going to let these people go down the tubes. We're going to help them. We're not going to let them go down. And yet nothing happens. And for a long time, I couldn't figure out where the disconnect was. And I thought I attributed it more to incompetence than evil. And now I have to attribute it to definite malevolence of forethought on the part of our State Department. And President Reagan is going to have to be fired up enough to take charge of himself, as he does occasionally. You know, if he'd asked the State Department about liberating Grenada, you think we would have done anything in Grenada? Nothing. Instead, he just moved on his own instincts. And unfortunately, he's a president who delegates responsibilities, as he ought to be able to. But first, you've got to choose people that you can delegate to. And George Shultz is not the kind of guy who is going to, in George Bush's terms, kick ass with the Russians. He's just, he is a status quo guy himself. He comes from big business, and he looks at things, I think, more in terms of the Secretary of Treasury than he does as a Secretary of State. And he has, in turn, delegated everything to the bureaucracy in the State Department. The people who are responsible for Afghanistan in the State Department are professional Foreign Service people, the classic quintessential Foreign Service officers, the striped pants types. Not people who have ever had any Afghanistan experience. Those people were all removed from any job having to do with Afghanistan quite some time back. because anybody who's ever been posted to Afghanistan cannot help but feel a great deal of sympathy and support for the Afghans. And in CIA and the Pentagon and in the State Department, everybody with genuine Afghan experience seemed to have been removed from any job that could relate to Afghanistan and sent off to unrelated posts. And the people we're dealing with now are people who speak with a forked tongue. They're double dealing. Their interest is not in protecting American interests or in protecting freedom or doing something that is right and moral and just. And certainly not interested in Afghanistan. These are people who will sacrifice the Afghans on the altar of appeasement to the god of disarmament. Negotiations at any cost, and the Afghans are a cheap cost. We've got to get to President Reagan somehow. It doesn't do any good to write letters to Secretary Shultz. He's going to pass them off to Ambassador Jerry Hellman, who's his head of the Interagency Joint Task Force in Afghanistan. A man who wears a cigar in front of his face like a sewer pipe, and I think his brains went out through it a long time ago. It's just, you know, he's got a man who working for him who's very much like the Hunchback was to Dracula, whatever his name was. We were trying to think it was Igor or something a while ago. And these are the kind of people we're dealing with there. We have got to get to President Reagan and also to Congress. Now, we have a joint task force working in Congress that is very good, and this is a good sign. For a long time, the Committee for a Free Afghanistan was kind of a voice crying in the wilderness. I ran that committee single-handedly for about 3 years. Now I have a wonderful staff, one of whom is one of your people. And we're doing great things and going great guns. And the more we do and the better we get, the more the State Department fights us. I don't know right now who's our worst enemy, the Kremlin or our own State Department.
Is there any difference?
Sometimes I wonder. Sometimes I wonder. The dirty things that are going on to try to stop the International Medical Corps from running American doctors in Afghanistan, or stop the Committee for a Free Afghanistan from achieving a goal of effective military and humanitarian aid for the Afghans. They have, like Gorbachev, they've taken off the gloves and are really playing a nasty game against us. But fortunately, I think the American people are basically with us, those that we've been able to reach, because the media doesn't help us. You know, the American media is very much like the shadri that the Afghan women wore before the liberation from the veil back in the 50s. This is something the Soviets are always claiming, is that the communist regime there wants to liberate women from the veil and educate women and so forth. Well, all this started happening in the 50s. But the shadri is a garment that covers you from here to the foot. I have one hanging in my office. I should have brought it. And all you can see out of it is through this very small latticed window that gives you a very narrow and distorted view of the world. Well, that's our media. You're not going to see anything except that little narrow distorted window view that they're going to give you, and Afghanistan's not in it. Except sometimes you'll pierce the blackout once in a while, or they'll give you a distorted view or a Soviet dispatch. But media coverage has been appalling on Afghanistan. I wish we could somehow make it chic like Ethiopia, because the situation in Afghanistan is far worse.
Far worse
than Ethiopia. The thing is, with Ethiopia, you can ignore the Soviet and the communist origins of the problems there and pass it off as an act of God and a natural disaster. In Afghanistan, if you're going to cover that story objectively and fairly, you have to point a finger of j'accuse at the Soviets, because you cannot ignore the fact that what is happening in Afghanistan is very much the intent of the Soviets.
Karen, would you tell us about the atrocities in Lagman province?
Oh, yes. Well, you know, atrocities have been going on since the beginning of this war, when the Soviets invaded Christmas time, 1979. And as they became increasingly frustrated with their inability to defeat the guerrillas, they turned more and more on the civilian population. It became more and more a war of terror. And then about 2 years ago, we saw a very ominous turn in the war in Afghanistan, as we saw evidence that there had been a policy decision made, a conscious policy decision that the civilian population now, the non-combatants, primarily women and children and old people, were now going to be the primary target of the Soviet army in Afghanistan. Mao Zedong wrote it a long time ago that the guerrilla moves among the people as the fish moves in the sea. In Afghanistan, they can't catch the fish, so the Soviets are draining the sea. In a way, this is kind of a sick compliment to the Afghan people, a recognition by the Soviets that they are fighting a truly popular people's movement, which they must surely envy, the sort of which they have boasted for many years, and they have got to envy it when they find it in reality. And in this war against the civilian population, it has taken the form of primarily a war of terror. It's a war of genocide, a war of scorched earth, but it's also a war of terror. To try to frighten the people if they cannot beat them into submission, to frighten them to where they will no longer support the Afghans and to where they will try to find a way to accommodate with the inevitable, meaning the Soviet occupation of their country. And these atrocities take, you know, unspeakable forms. You know, even the Nazis didn't do the kind of things the Russians are doing. Logman has seen many massacres. Logman, like every other province in Afghanistan, has seen, you know, atrocities beyond words. But the reports that we got a few weeks ago from Logman seem to carry it into yet another realm of horror. A report of a 2-day-old infant tied to a spit and roasted alive in front of the eyes of its parents. And then the parents were shot. We've been hearing for years of children having their throats slit with bayonets, of pregnant women being disemboweled, of girls snatched from villages, raped at 15,000 feet, and then hurled from helicopters back into their villages. Things like this. The report from Logman is really no different. It only reflects a greater degree of intensity of what has been happening to the Afghan people. But you know, I've never been to Afghanistan before this war started. I don't know what Afghanistan was, but we've gotten some pictures of what that country used to be. And I think we ought to look at a few of them to put these atrocities and these horrors in perspective. And my good assistant Kathleen Brooks has assisted me in putting together a few representative slides of this country, if I may show you, because pictures are worth thousands of words, as you know. But the country is a beautiful, splendid country, 90% mountains, vertical terrain, which is one of the problems the Soviets had when they invaded that country. They came into Afghanistan prepared to fight World War III on the plains of Europe all over again. And they found themselves wheeling and maneuvering division-sized elements against ghosts and shadows that disappeared like phantoms in the night. You cannot wheel a division of tanks against a squad of guerrillas who are operating in their own terrain, in mountains and cliffs where they know every cave and every nook and cranny. And the Soviets have been very slow to adopt to this, which is why they've turned against the people. Largely it was the terrain of Afghanistan, the nature of the Afghans, the climate, and everything else to do with the topography that made it impossible for the Soviets to successfully fight a guerrilla war. But we have seen in Afghanistan no fewer than 5 different wars fought by 4 different armies. But as I said, they came in with these division-sized elements, armored units, motorized rifles, tanks, and so forth. And they look at these terraces here. Afghanistan was a country that was intensely cultivated in the few areas that could be cultivated. Many areas of the country can't grow anything like the Hazarajat. Everything has to be imported there to eat, even back in the old days. And the Soviets are trying very hard to starve out the Hazarajat. That's the mountainous stronghold running down the mountainous spine of Afghanistan. But in the areas that could be cultivated, you found these kind of very carefully built terraces. The water system has been built over the millennia and is very intricate. And the entire country is laced with a network, an underground network of aquifers that the people have learned to use as bomb shelters when the Soviets are known to be coming. But the Soviets have learned that the people are going to hide in these underground aquifers, and every so many 100 meters there's a well that goes down to the aquifer that the people go down in and they pull the stone in over them. And a couple of years ago in Logman province again, there was a terrible massacre where 106 men and boys down to the age of 6 were slaughtered by the Soviets in one of these aquifers with both chemical weapons and incendiaries. And I would describe this as having killed these people 3 times, because any one of the munitions the Soviets used in that aquifer would have killed those people. But it was done more for the terror effect, because the bodies literally melted to the walls of the caves, of the aquifer. And the survivors, the rescuers who went in to try to bring them out, were overcome by the noxious, lethal chemical agents that were left behind too. That's why I say the people of Logman and other areas of Afghanistan have seen so much that the Afghans can understand our keen interest in atrocities or chemical weapons or anything like that, because they say the Russians do it every day. What they should care about is not how they kill us, but the fact that they're killing us. Because the Soviets, they don't care whether they kill you with an AK round or a missile or chemical weapons, so long as they accomplish the mission. And chemical weapons are a very cheap combat multiplier. They're a cheap weapon of mass destruction, like nuclear weapons. And while nuclear weapons are a terrifying possibility that are always held over our head, chemical weapons are a terrifying reality, being used by the Soviets and their proxies in half a dozen countries. But anyway, we have here, this is Afghanistan before the Soviets came. A beautiful, carefully tended nation. Was able to feed itself and export wheat to Russia, to Pakistan, to India, and to other places. It's largely an agrarian society. AFL-CIO has not been interested in supporting us in Afghanistan because there's no labor movement there, no union movement to support. Look at these kids. You know, they're a happy people. The Afghans are a proud people, fiercely independent, God-fearing. Fanaticism has no place in Afghanistan. You could never have a rise of a Khomeini. You could never have a mullah-led government in Afghanistan because these people wouldn't tolerate it. They're a cussedly independent people. They're often called the Jews of Asia, and some believe that they are one of the lost tribe. And they're certainly very much like God's stiff-necked people, as he described them to Moses. And they're spirited. They have a literature, a culture that's 5,000 years old. It's not so much a written culture, because being a pre-modern society, most folks are illiterate there. The stories, and the music, and the poetry have been passed down generation after generation. They're handsome people. You'll see blonde, blue-eyed Afghans. You'll see red-headed, green-eyed Afghans. You'll see kids with flaxen hair and almost transparent blue eyes. You'll see people who look like Indians, like Chinese, like Asiatics. It's probably the richest polyglot tapestry of humanity in any nation in the world. Hitler's original aliens were Afghans, the Pathan tribesmen of the border areas with Pakistan. There's one of the beautiful lakes in Afghanistan. It's an arid country, basically, but there is a lot of water in certain areas, which they transport by means of these underground aquifers all over the nation. And the Soviets have targeted these aquifers as a means of destroying the resistance. And when I say destroying the resistance in Afghanistan, I mean destroying the people, because it is genuinely a grassroots popular resistance there. They're denuding the soil of Afghanistan of everything that lives or grows, of all vegetable, animal, and human life. Even the water systems, the very ecology must be destroyed in order to destroy the resistance. There are places of it that look like my home in the high Sierras of California. This was an autumn picture. See the beautiful trees in golden color. Clear, fresh rivers. Herding sheep, herding camels, yaks up in the Wakhan corridor that's been annexed by the Soviets, horses. The animals are fond, the Afghans are fond of their animals and take good care of them. They're not like the Arabs who abuse their animals, with the exception of the Arabian horse and the Saluki dog. But I have never, I see cattle in the fields wearing blankets to protect them from the cold or the sun. Cattle, and sheep and all. They're very, very careful of their animals. And then we have what the Russians have brought to Afghanistan. From Russia with love. Fortunately, in Soviet manufacture, sewing machines, washing machines, automobiles, and munitions, they have very poor quality control. And a goodly percentage of their munitions fail to explode. And this is a dud bomb, a rocket that has been delivered to these children's village. Of course, you know that a dud can explode at any time. I remember standing in Lebanon trying to take some pictures there once, and I couldn't get my footing, so I finally looked down and see what was the matter with the rock I was trying to stand on, and it had fins. And it was about 6 feet long and about that big around. It was a dud 2-ton bomb that I was trying to stand on while I was taking pictures. I vacated the area as quickly as I could. But the Afghans have to live with these things. They can't leave so easily. It's a long trek to Pakistan. That's an even bigger one that these kids have for their seat. The next few pictures are of children and women who are survivors of the massacre at Urgun last fall. There are a number of villages in the area of Urgun. Urgun was a Soviet fortress that has been besieged by the Afghans for several years. And it'll probably be written up one day in the history of campaigns like Gallipoli and and other great campaigns, because it's been a long-standing one, seesawing back and forth. Well, the Soviets finally came in power and destroyed not only the Mujahid positions around Orgun, but all of the villages in a wide perimeter around the fortress. And these kids are the survivors, and most of them died about a week or two later of freezing, because all their shelter was gone and they couldn't make it to Pakistan soon enough. So most of the children you see in these pictures died. This little boy picked up a gift of the Soviets. The Soviets have designed a bomb expressly and exclusively intended for children. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of a people is it who would design a bomb only intended to maim and mutilate children? They're disguised as little girls' dollies, as balls, as chewing gum, as little red fire trucks, toy airplanes, toy birds, toy butterflies. Yes, this is one. This little boy is in Ghazni. This picture was taken by Jack Wheeler, I believe some of you know, in Ghazni. This is little Nabib. He picked up a toy, and he thought it was a butterfly, and it blew off both of his hands. Now, the Soviets wanted this to happen to Nabib. They wanted it to happen to Nabib. That's their intention. It's part of the war of terror against the Afghan people, to design bombs to maim and mutilate the children, not to kill them, but to send them through life looking like this. This little boy picked up a toy bomb, and it blew off his right hand. He's about, what, 2 years old or so. Same thing with this little child. He was in a village that was bombed, not a toy bomb, but his village was bombed, and he was badly injured by shrapnel, flame, and you know, the other effects of a bombing of a village. He was about 4 years old or so, lost his right leg in the bombing. And of course you see the damage to his face from the fire and the shrapnel. This young man was about 19 years old when he was napalmed. He lay in a hospital. He was burned over almost 90% of his body. Somehow he lived, and he was brought to Pakistan. It took him more than a month on a camel, having been burned over 90% of his body. And they expected him to die. There was no way this young man could live. Nobody lives burned this much. And somehow he did for 2 years. And the doctors in Pakistan could do nothing for him except to save his life. He was finally gotten to a hospital in Germany last year. He's been there a year now, and I understand he's now walking. The Germans have taken him as far as they can. The Committee for Free Afghanistan will probably be bringing this young man to the States now for further surgery, because he cannot move his knees or his elbows or his wrists or his ankles. The joints are all frozen by the scar tissue. But he's going to live, and he's going to make it, and he's going to be back. This boy picked up a toy bomb. He was about 12 years old and should have known better. But he picked up a toy bomb. You know, the older children and the adults have all been warned, don't pick up anything on the ground that looks attractive. The Afghan freedom fighters now carry slingshots with them, along with their Kalashnikov rifles and their 303s. And if they see a fountain pen or a box of cigarettes or anything lying on the trail, they ping it with a slingshot first and see if it explodes, and then they pick it up. This child stepped on one. And mines caused the loss of a lot of lives. I should have brought with me one of these little devices. I have a few of them around, defused of course. But the Afghans lose a lot of casualties. This little device fits in the palm of your hand. The Afghans call it a butterfly because it rather looks like one. And it's filled with a liquid explosive. We don't know what kind of stuff it is. It's like nitroglycerin, but it's not. And it contains only enough power to blow off a man's foot. And of course the Afghans have no shoes. They're barefoot out there on the Hindu Kush. We're trying to find ways to get them effective combat boots or other footwear. But you know, one of the greatest causes of loss of freedom fighters is stepping on a mine. And more than 99% of the Afghans who are wounded in Afghanistan die for lack of medical attention. But they die slow. They die of blood poisoning, of loss of blood, of shock, of gangrene, of infection, of hunger after they're wounded and can't get around and get food. And the lucky few who make it to Pakistan are generally extremity wounds like this, because they have a better chance of surviving the long trek. It can take 3 to 6 months to make it to Pakistan to a hospital on a camel or on a donkey. from various areas inside Afghanistan. But I call these high-tech punji stakes. You remember in Vietnam, the Viet Cong were very fond of using punji stakes in the ground where our GIs were likely to travel. You know, there were sharpened bamboo stakes tipped with one thing or another that would cause infections. And that's basically what these things are. They blow off a foot, they take a fighter out of action, and they tie up 2 or 3 people taking care of him to get him to the rear. This is not too good a picture, but this young man also stepped on a landmine. These little scatter mines that are delivered by the tens of thousands over villages and trails everywhere that Afghans are likely to go, whether they be freedom fighters or farmers or refugees or children. The Soviets sow thousands and thousands and thousands of these little mines. They're camouflaged so you can hardly see them in the areas where people are likely to walk. This is a bomb fragment that took out part of his face. He was a very handsome youth of about 21 years old. And that's what's left of his face after the fighting. He was a freedom fighter. He's back inside fighting now. Again, a landmine injury. This young man's foot has been blown off by a landmine, and then it developed proud flesh and all of the other complications from an untended wound like that. That is a human face. That young man took a bomb right in the face. And remarkably, miraculously, he has been repaired and restored. Somehow he did not lose both his eyes. They've rebuilt his face to where it almost resembles a human face, and he too is back inside fighting. It took a long time to repair that young fellow. This old man, 67 years old, he lost his foot to a landmine, and then gangrene developed, and they had to progressively amputate until he finally amputated the hip, because it was almost a year before he got to a hospital in Pakistan for medical care. So you see they've taken his leg off at the hip. And you see how emaciated he is. That's how he was when he arrived, suffering from the obvious severe effects of severe malnutrition. He was a freedom fighter commander, that old man, and he's back inside now with a prosthesis, with an artificial leg from hip down, and most of the time he rides a horse, and he's back inside leading his freedom fighters against the Russians.
It's unbelievable.
Courage like you never saw.
What other people on the face of the earth would respond like this?
This is the lesson in this to us. We can stop there and we'll go on with the rest of them later. You know, you could almost say, well, it's because the Afghans are uncivilized and they're uneducated that they don't know any better than to fight the Russians. And, you know, that's a lot of people say. But they have shown us that if you're willing to sacrifice, willing to pay the ultimate price, that you can prevail. As I've said before, Soviet empire is not immutable or inevitable. It doesn't have to happen. And I liken the Soviet empire to a brush fire or a forest fire, which you folks here in Southern California are very familiar with. As it burns outward, the interior of it is totally consumed. There's nothing left inside. It's just all blackened ash. But so long as that fire can maintain its outward dynamism, as long as it keeps burning outward, it will continue to live. In Afghanistan, that fire has finally met fire and can be forced back upon itself. And if we can ever stop that outward burn of Soviet imperialism, it will have to fall back in on itself, and there's nothing left there. And it will consume itself and be finished once and for all. And if we give those people in Afghanistan the effective aid they need, especially effective anti-aircraft weapons and food and medical support, and the other things that they must have to survive, it could be the high water mark of Soviet imperialism. It could be the beginning of the end for the Soviet empire.
Are any mercenaries from outside nations going to help them?
Absolutely not. The Afghans won't have them.
They won't.
They are some of the world's finest fighting men, the finest marksmen. They wrote the book on guerrilla warfare. They're ferociously proud and independent. And they say, like Churchill said in 1940, just give us the tools to do the job and we'll do it for ourselves. We don't need your troops. I happen to know of a number of soldiers of fortune, not mercenaries. Most mercenaries are misnamed. Most of them do it because they feel that evil has got to be fought, that communism's got to be fought, and they'll go anywhere that they can hire onto a war and fight the Russians or fight their proxies. But in Afghanistan, I do know of a group of about 30, I think there were 38 of them, who went over a few years ago and offered their services. And the Afghans gave him a cup of tea and were very polite, but said thank you very much, but no thank you, and sent them on their way. All they need are the tools to do the job, and they can do it for themselves. They don't need American troops. They don't need mercenaries. They don't need anything else. They do need training. They do need some advisors. But basically, they need the tools to do the job, and they can do it.
What's the best way for us to put pressure on the President, Congress, and the State Department to get those tools to them?
Letters. You know, Congress reads his mail, the President reads his mail, even the big network producers and editors read their mail. Nobody's invulnerable to public pressure in this country. We are a democracy. To the media, it's money. To politicians, it's votes. And they do read their mail, and it does count. You will frequently hear on the news, you know, well, Congressman so-and-so got umpty-ump letters in favor of this policy and umpty-ump letters against this policy, so he's going to vote for this policy. And the same with the President. He has to be made aware that the American people are outraged by the raw deal the Afghans are getting, both from the Soviets and the Americans, and that we, the American people, want the Afghans to be supported. Write letters also to members of Congress, to the President, to your representatives in Congress, and to your media people.
Who are the key blocks in Congress that we want to write to convince them to?
There are no blocks in Congress anymore. Congress is almost unanimously in support of aiding the Freedom Fighters.
Then who is blocking the support?
Even congressmen like Markey and Solars, who are not known to be conservatives, not your garden variety of conservative. Paul Tsongas was one of our strongest supporters in Congress before he retired. We have people like this who say, you know, anything we can do to help the Afghans. Some of them want to do it to prove their anti-communist credentials, to show they're not really soft on Marxists. But others do it because they're genuinely committed and concerned. The block is in the State Department.
It's not even in the Senate?
No, absolutely not. The Senate is primarily conservative, and the House, which is primarily liberal, is still pro-Afghan. You know, anything that the President does is going to have the unanimous support of Congress. They have passed one resolution after another, sense of Congress resolution, joint resolutions, mandating the President to do everything that is needed in the way of military and humanitarian aid to save the Afghans. And whether their reasons were for moral purposes or for ideological purposes or strategic or just to show they're not soft on the commies is irrelevant. They did it. The President knows he's got a mandate from Congress. Even the Washington Post, the Pravda on the Potomac, has editorials saying, arm the Afghans.